To illustrate this meaning-obsessed approach to symptomatic statements, and to better put us on a different path, that of the sign, I'm going to venture a strange but I hope clarifying diagram. And it's the diagram that I drew on the screen in front of you. On the one side, you see the analytic discourse. On the other side, you see the capitalist discourse. And in between, in green, you see their common connection. The approach we're tracing here, that on the side of meaning, is the one you see extending from S2 to /S down to S1. And we can trace it with a different color here to make it a little clearer. I'll add some yellow here. S2 to /S down to S1. Here's that trajectory again. But from here, by adding the capitalist discourse, I'm showing where it goes from there. From S1 to S2 to little a to /S to S1 and so on. Now what you see is the capitalist discourse. And I draw it with an infinity sign so you can see just how this thing goes and the fact that it never stops. This diagram, I think, is pretty useful. And again, the key element here is that S1 that you see in the bottom middle of this juxtaposition. In the capitalist discourse, S1 isn't a slip, a stumble, a stammer, an error, or a lapsus, and it's certainly not a symptom, no matter how symptomatic it might be. Instead, S1 in the capitalist discourse is a commodity, a desirable consumer good. Indeed, it's a shiny object. Be it a product, a label, a logo, it's any signifier of status in a consumer economy. Consider, for instance, that purse or handbag whose designer and even price tag you know from across the street. How about those white earbuds, those AirPods that Apple makes? And if you're retro chic, you've got the ones with the cords still rocking. You know what, though? I don't even need to tell you that they're made by Apple. The whiteness of those earbuds, AirPods, the cords and everything, that's the signal. You already know Apple makes those devices, and the user is a consumer of Apple products. Those are S1s. How about red-bottomed women's shoes? I don't know much about it, but a friend of mine told me that means something, and you can spot those red-bottomed shoes and know their price from across the street. In each case, what we see as S1 is not a signifier of slippage, error, failure, or incoherence. What we see in the capitalist discourse is an S1 that is not functioning as a symptom, but as a signifier of success, style, consistency, achievement. It's a shiny object indeed. And all, as you well know at this point, in service to helping its possessor, that capitalist consumer subject, feel whole, complete, singular, autonomous, in short, one. Like its sibling, the master, the capitalist knows how to put the one in S1, ever in service to themselves, becoming just that, the one, the man, the queen, the shit, the goat, you name it. And they never seem to tire of just that, you naming it. Make no mistake. The side of meaning here is numerical. Meaning for Lacan is a numbers game, and all the more so when it besets analytic experience. When analyst and analysand rush at symptomatic statements with floods of meaning and ever in search of more, they treat it as a numerical expression, even a numerical code, whose quantification and calculation and verifiability, indeed whose numerical value, as we read in television, can be determined. And by determined, you know what I mean. I mean oneified. I mean turned into one. I mean universalized. By universalized, of course, I also mean linguistified. Assigned to the arena of enunciated knowledge, which is all that of being means to Lacan. This is what he's doing with the one on page 10 in television at the end of section 2. It is because every signifier, from the phoneme to the sentence, Lacan says, can serve as a coded message, a personal, as the radio was wont to say during the war, that it emerges as an object or as object, and that one discovers that it is what determines that in the world of the speaking being, one occurs. That is to say, element occurs. The Greek, and then there's a fancy Greek word. But don't get lost in this bit. Lacan's one occurs phrase, in keeping with that Yadlin from Seminar 19b, don't trip about that. Check out our series on 19b. We'll talk you through it. And how about that Greek word? It's even written in Greek in the text. It's not even transliterated. It's stoichion. It's an odd word. It's not one you encounter very often. I mean, for those of you that fuck around in ancient Greek. But here's what it means. It means that one occurs, that there is one, that there is one element, one principle, a single letter, and so on. That's the stoichion. It's an atomistic approach to speaking being, premised on the belief that the basic part of any given system, structure, or idea is singular. That's what Lacan is getting at here. The belief that the founding aspect of any given system, structure, or idea is singular. In other words, one. Earth, there's an option. Wind, there's another. Fire, there's a third. And don't forget their roadie, water. Or choose your favorite letter in the alphabet. Not 2, but 1. Not 3, 1. Just 1. Indeed, there can be only one. Stoichion. More than Lacan's fancy French Yadlin or his recourse to the equally elaborate Greek stoichion, I think it's the coded message part of the passage we just read that matters. And not so much the message, that'll be for later, but its code. The French here is essential, and it ripples throughout television. The word in question is chiffre. And my French isn't great, so I'll spell it for you, and then you can then search it out in the document. Chiffre, chiffre. It's the word Lacan uses here, and it ripples throughout the entire text. You've got to check this out. What is chiffre in the French? It means code, for sure, but also, more directly, digit, numeral, number. And as I recalled for you in our series on Seminar 19a, where we also encounter that word, its etymology is hella revealing. Chiffre descends from the Old French, medieval Latin, Spanish, Italian, but ultimately from the Arabic safr, meaning 0 or not. And more literally, empty, nothing. You could even take this motherfucker back to Sanskrit if you wanted to. Sunyas, meaning empty. The numbers in question here are empty numbers. So when Lacan says that the side of meaning is a numbers game, and that's more or less what he says, my friends, it's not just the number one, as in there is oneness, that he has in mind. Also, more elusively, it's the emptiness of the one. It's the zeroed out existential status of the one that he's gesturing towards. You see, oneness for Lacan, like every shiny S1 in the capitalist discourse, ultimately amounts to nothing. It's a vacuous, empty, and fundamentally meaningless way to be in the world. Meaning, in this sense, ever yields its opposite. Which is why Lacan tells us elsewhere that meaning, like understanding, is a trap. So also with consumer capitalism. You don't need to hear it from me, but here it is one more time nonetheless. Consumer capitalism promises to add meaning to our lives, but it only ever leaves our lives feeling meaningless. No matter how many fancy handbags, AirPods, and red-soled high-heeled shoes and shiny watches we sport around town. What looks like an ad, hear me now, it turns out to be a loss. Out of addition, subtraction. Subtraction of what? One type of meaning more than any other is drained along the way. Jouissance, enjoyment. We know this to be true, but it doesn't stop us. So the code to be cracked here in that passage we just read, it's why and how on earth we could continue as though this code hasn't already been cracked. You know this about capitalist consumer economies, and yet we just keep going. No better definition of late capitalism than just that. Here again, we find no better definition of the racetrack that you see on your screen in the capitalist discourse. It's an interminable racetrack of consumerism followed by dissatisfaction and more consumerism. That's why the yellow symbol on your screen overlaying the capitalist discourse is the symbol for infinity. It knows no end. Let me be precise. The capitalist discourse has no dead ends. It knows nothing of impasse. But also note, in the diagram on your screen, with every return to the barred subject, that slashed S, with every return to this motherfucker, this speaking being, and every subsequent movement from them through the embodied act of speaking to its effect, that S1 as symptomatic said. Here I'm talking about the green on your screen. From slashed S down to S1. This is part of the capitalist discourse. And what I'm telling you is that with every return to the barred subject and from them down into that S1, what else do we see? We also see in this diagram an opportunity to swerve off the racetrack. We see an opportunity to embark on a different trajectory, to turn off of the capitalist discourse and into the analytic discourse instead. So, the directions here, turn south at split subject. But when you come to the S1, don't turn left, my friends. The trick is to learn to turn right. and in so turning, to turn from S1 to that little abject A in the analytic half of this diagram. And I'll draw it again, this time though, with a different color to illustrate the right-hand turn that we are talking about here, from S1 up to little a, that puts you in a different circuit. This brings us, at long last, if you ask me, to the other side of language, insofar as the unconscious is implicated, as Lacan puts it on page 7. Here, we have finally arrived not at the meaning side of things, but on the side that Lacan defines as that of the sign. Meaning puts us on the side of the capitalist. The sign puts us on the side of the analytic discourse. And it's this that is now before us. There's a preamble, always with Lacan. And the preamble leading up to the side of the sign, as opposed to that of meaning in television, is so rich and suggestive that I'd be remiss to leave it untouched here. Let's just take it a few points all at once. Why, my friends, is the unconscious structured like a language? Because, Lacan tells us, it is ordered by the symbolic structure that results from producing language out of la langue. Emphasis on ordered. The unconscious is ordered by language as it emerges from la langue. Language, you know, is what we attempt to fathom about la langue. And the formation of the unconscious, Lacan is here telling us, is among its byproducts. Boom. Right there on page 8 in the preamble to the side of the sign, you get an answer to the question, why, again, one more time, is the unconscious structured like a language? All of which, though, Lacan hurries to add, reminds us that to the side of meaning, the study of language opposes the side of the sign. This preamble only allows him to then say, in opposition to meaning, when the unconscious is involved, we can study language on the side of the sign. It's on page 8. Check it out. And in fact, that's exactly where we want to turn our attention. Notice where Lacan goes on page 8. Almost like clockwork. He says, to the side of meaning, the study of language opposes the side of the sign. And then in the very next line, final paragraph on page 8, he is right back at it precisely where you think he would go, straight to the symptom. Check it out. How is it that even the symptom, or that which is so-called an analysis, failed to mark out a path in this matter? Such was the situation until Freud, whose docility before the hysteric was needed for him to read dreams, slips, even jokes, as one deciphers a message in code. There it is again. Once more, we have a coded message. And here again, the word Lacan uses is chiffre. But we're no longer focused on the code, that chiffre, that number, any number, call it 1 or call it 0. That ain't what we're talking about anymore. It's no longer about the digit. It's the message more than its code that interested Freud, Lacan suggests here. Or more precisely, and I think this part is key, it's the deciphering of this code en route to a message that interested Freud on Lacan's reading. And I would offer Lacan as well. What is this deciphering, this dechiffrage, deformation, disfiguration, denumeration, perhaps? Or maybe it's just a careful way of reading that we have to figure out. Again, I think the French matters here. To work on the side of the sign, here represented by the analytic side of the diagram before you, is to enjoy deciphering coded messages. So what's it like in the pink, as we say, looking at this diagram on the analytic side? What's it like over there? There's a whole hell of a lot enjoyment, a whole hell of a lot of enjoying that comes with the deciphering of coded messages. Now, we don't know what deciphering means yet, but we're getting close. All you got to do to get a sense is just add a little DE to the front of Lacan's chiffre, and you've got the word for deciphering. From chiffre to déchiffre. It's really as simple as that. Or, as we see in the next paragraph on page 9, déchiffrage. It's great. It's really one worth noting here. Lacan continues from this riff on Freud. Let one simply go to Freud's texts, grouped under those 3 headings. Their titles are now trivial, and one will see that it is about nothing other than a deciphering of pure signifying dimension. There's that dimension you heard me mention in the last lecture. What is at stake in all of this, it seems to me, is method and object. This is what's at stake here. The method that we exercise on the side of the sign is not one of numerical expression, but its undoing. Not ciphering, but deciphering. And in service to enjoy meant. We don't yet know what this entails, but again, I think we're getting close. A clue comes with that second part, the object of our deciphering. What Lacan here calls the pure signifying dimension at the top of page 9. Note again the DIT in the front of dimension. We've been hammering on this point since our series on l'étourdi. The DIT mention is the said mansion. From the French di, meaning said, and the Latin mansio, meaning, among other things, dwelling. Here, again, notice, we are not talking about an act of saying. We are talking about what is said as a result. The object for the method of deciphering that Lacan assigns to Freud here in television is less corporal than linguistic. It's not about saying, it's about what is said, and as such it is less corporal than it is linguistic. With the addition of pure signifying, however, Lacan wants to orient us towards a very specific dimension, not that of language, but that of which language is comprised, la langue. More than the structure of enunciated knowledge. Read meaning, Lacan wants to orient us toward la langue. Not the meaning that we make and call language, but the la langue of which this meaning is made. So when it comes to dreams, slips, jokes, and the like, Lacan is here suggesting, as an interpretation of Freud, which is usually when you know Lacan's taking some giant steps of his own, that we should read these dreams, slips, jokes, and the like with our ears in response to what he calls here their naive articulations. And this is where things get a little loopy and I think a little experimental. So maybe this will all turn out to be incorrect in hindsight, but it seems to resonate pretty well here now. As long as we can remember that the type of reading or deciphering that we're after here is one that can only be done with the ears. Because remember, when it comes to Lacan, we are thinking about the acoustic level of language. Lacan is determined as hell, it seems to me, to spell this out. And that's exactly where he goes on page 9, after these flourishes into Freud. I don't know that it makes a lot of sense, but I think it's pretty damn intriguing and definitely worthy of our attention. On the side of the sign, he now wants to explain the type of deciphering that would come with it. Continuing on page 9. Articulated naively, he says, that's how we should be listening to the signifiers that pop in this pure signifying dimension when we encounter a symptom, be it a joke, a pun, a slip, a forgetting, whatever. Now he wants to explain what he means by naively articulated. And check this out. Articulated means verbalized. Naively means according to vulgar logic, Lalonde's usage as it is commonly received. So we are indeed talking about speech events that effect symptomatic SEDS. So we're listening to the production of a certain pure signifying dimension, a signifying dimension governed by the acoustic level of language, these naive verbalizations, according to Lacan. But that's not all. Notice where he goes from here in the second half of page 9. All you have to do, he says, as the wisdom of the Stoics had achieved so early on, is to distinguish the signifier from the signified, to translate, as did Saussure, their Latinized names, so as to witness phenomena of equivalence appearing there in such a way that one can understand how, for Freud, they could provide the figure of the machinery of an energetics. I've talked about a side of the sign in order to mark in its association with the signifier. But the signifier differs from the sign in that its inventory is already given of Lacan, or given in Lacan, depending on how you translate this. To speak of a code doesn't work, Lacan says, precisely because it presupposes meaning. The signifying inventory of Lacan supplies only the cipher of meaning. According to context, each word takes on an enormous and disparate range of meaning, meaning whose heteroclite condition is often attested to by the dictionary. I find this to be the squirreliest passage in television. It's on page 9, and so you know I want to get in there and see if we can make some sense of it. Whether we can or not, time will tell. And let me say one more thing about this time that will tell. It's fucking short, so let's try and keep this brief. These passages on page 9 that you just heard me read can be summed up, and I'm going to give it a try. First, to treat symptomatic SEDS on the side of the sign, I'm suggesting from these passages that it means to read them, which is another way to translate déchiffrer, to read. You read between and beyond their codes, since failure to do so would leave us on the side of meaning. And I think that's a pretty important part, probably one worth reiterating here. To treat symptomatic SEDS, or statements, these S1s on the side of the sign, is to read between and beyond their specific codes. Because if you fail to do so and you remain at the level of their codes, you remain on the side of meaning. Second big point here, and it's a but. But it is also to read between and beyond their specific signifiers, into the signifying inventory of Lacan, as Lacan puts it here. Hence, I think, the addition of that pure on page 9. It's less about the specific signifiers that locate the symptom in a dimension, a linguistified realm of the said, than it is about the pure signifying it does at the level of voiced, verbalized, spoken discourse, in short, the acoustic level of language use, in sonic, homophonic knots of enjoyment. However weird that sounds, pause, back up, and listen to it again. I agree it sounds weird, but check it out. I don't even think we've gone far enough yet with this line of inquiry, or at least so Lacan would suggest. You know what he means by the signifier, right? The signifier for Lacan is what represents the subject to another signifier. He's been saying it since the early 1960s and insisting that there's no other definition of the signifier in his work. The signifier is what represents the subject to another signifier. But what, my friends, is Lacan's definition of the sign? You also see him coughing one up in Seminar 11, more or less the same time he starts defining the signifier. The sign, Lacan claims in Seminar 11, is what represents something for someone. Notice, we are no longer dealing with Saussure, it seems to me, but Charles Sanders Peirce instead. Let me try and be clear, because again, time is short. Signs are addressed. Indeed, they are messages, messages sent. The signifier is the medium, no doubt, but the sign is their message. To study the symptom on the side of the sign is not just to consider the signifying resonances of Lacan, of which it's comprised, but also the fact that it's addressed to someone, for someone, aimed at someone even. We're not talking about a voice in the wilderness here. We're talking about a voice that is directed at you, dear analyst. More than the signifier, I'm telling you the sign is a missive. It's ballistic through and through. Now, before things get too weird, let's try and add this up. If symptoms are coded messages, to treat them on the side of meaning is to focus on their code, while to treat them on the side of the sign is to focus on their message. That's how this thing stacks up. And this, I would say, is what Lacan means by deciphering, déchiffrage. We read the symptom as a bit of Lacan addressed to us, even if only transferentially so. And we do so with our ears. But again, we haven't gone far enough. We can't stop, won't stop here, because there's still more. To read symptomatic SEDS with our ears is also to enjoy doing so. So let's be categorical with this, in keeping with what Lacan is doing in television. Psychoanalysis is a gay science. And before you get it too far twisted, notice what Lacan means by this on page 22 of Television. In contrast with sadness, there is the gay science, which is a virtue. A virtue absolves no one from sin, which is, as everyone knows, original. The virtue that I designate as the gay science exemplifies it by showing clearly of what it consists, not understanding, not a diving at the meaning, but a flying over it as low as possible without the meanings gumming up this virtue. Thus, enjoying the deciphering, which implies that in the end, gay science cannot but meet in it the fall, the return into sin. And you best not hear Nietzsche here, or at least not just Nietzsche here. Follow footnote 10 on page 22. It's a good clue as to what Lacan's doing here with gay science. Gay science precedes Nietzsche. Nietzsche didn't just make that shit up. It comes from medieval artistic culture in Provence, in southern France. It's what troubadours called their joyful approach to music, poetry, and even courtly love, especially in lyrical poetry, much of which celebrated love. Intellectual skill, affective artistry, and wonderfully timed lightheartedness. This was the gay science, their gay science. And if you follow Lacan, it should be ours as well, even if you're still learning to laugh like a saint. You see, on the other side of meaning, there is the sign, which means that on the side of meaning and all of its love stories, you have opposed to it the side of the sign, where we don't hear love stories, but instead laughter. The same laughter that comes from comedy. Comedy that, according to Lacan, as we heard in the last lecture, is aware of the non-rapport. On the side of meaning, we hear love stories that float the sexual boat in belief that the one is. But on the side of the sign, we hear laughter, even if you can't bellow it out yet, saint in progress. On the side of the sign, we are inclined towards laughter, levitas, lightness, the gayest of sciences imaginable. Which is why I would also wager again that it's jouissance that's at stake here. The analysand's jouissance that's at stake here. And I would call your attention to one more passage in service to this insight. Again, Lacan telling us what Freud is up to. Bottom of 18, top of 19 in Television. What Freud articulates as primary process in the unconscious, and this is me speaking here, Lacan says, but you can look it up and you'd see it. It isn't something to be numerically expressed, but to be deciphered. I mean jouissance itself. In which case it doesn't result in energy and can't be registered as such. The jouissance, the enjoyment of messages being deciphered. That's what you see on the left-hand side of the diagram on your screen. And I would say that that is a pretty fitting object for psychoanalytic inquiry in and beyond the clinic, which is certainly one way to read, by which I mean to decipher those utterly enigmatic final riffs in Lacan's report on Seminar 19B or worse, a report that was published at just about the same time as Television was conducted. and one passage from this report in particular. It goes like this. The sign is obsession that seeds, makes an obsession, spelt with a C, to the jouissance that decides upon a practice. To read symptoms as signs, I'm suggesting, is to listen for knots of enjoyment, jouissance, in the langue, that they not only carry with them, but also deliver unto thee, and to obsessively yield before them, in theory and technique alike.